It is the world's oldest murder case, a crime scene frozen in time for over 5,000 years, preserved with such extraordinary precision that modern forensic investigators can reconstruct not just the cause of death, but the final hours of the victim's life. His last meal, his last journey, his last moments of trust before someone he knew put an arrow in his back. The victim's name is Ötzi, and his case has never been closed. On September 19, 1991, the mummified body of a man was discovered in the Ötztal Alps at an altitude of 3,210 meters, on the border between Austria and Italy. Two hikers stumbled upon him in a rocky gully and initially assumed they had found the remains of a recently deceased mountaineer. They had no idea they were looking at a man who had died approximately 3,300 years before the birth of Christ. A man who had been lying in that gully, perfectly preserved by the glacier that swallowed him, for 5,300 years. They called him Ötzi after the Ötztal Alps where he was found, and from the moment he was lifted from the ice, he became the most studied human corpse in history. Each year, thousands visit his mummified remains contained in a special cold cell at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy. Scientists have probed every centimeter of his body. They have analyzed his DNA, his gut bacteria, his bone density, his tattoos, the pollen trapped in his digestive tract, the food in his stomach, the blood on his weapons. They have built a picture of his life with extraordinary intimacy, and in doing so, they have built an equally extraordinary picture of his death. For the first 20 years after his discovery, nobody was certain how Ötzi died. Initial theories ranged from exposure to exhaustion. He was old, for his era, and the mountains were unforgiving. Perhaps he simply lay down and did not get up. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved. Then in 2001, a scientist reviewing an old X-ray noticed something that had been missed. Advanced forensic analysis, particularly CT scans and X-rays, gradually peeled back the layers of ice and time, revealing a far more dramatic and violent end for the Iceman. The most compelling evidence for a violent death came in 2001, when a precisely aimed flint arrowhead was discovered lodged in Ötzi's left shoulder, nestled just beneath his clavicle. It had been sitting there for 5,000 years, and nobody had seen it. The arrow had entered from behind, piercing a major artery, the subclavian artery, and causing rapid, massive internal bleeding. This wound would have been almost immediately fatal, leading to paralysis of the left arm and swift blood loss. Ötzi had not died from the cold. He had not collapsed from exhaustion. He had been murdered, shot from behind by someone who knew exactly where to aim. And that was only the beginning of what the evidence would reveal. Because forensic science does not stop at cause of death. It builds a timeline. It reconstructs a story. And the story that emerged from Ötzi's frozen body over the next 2 decades is one of the most astonishing true crime narratives in human history. It begins, as all good murder investigations do, with the crime scene. Ötzi's curators actually contacted Detective Inspector Alexander Horn of the Munich police to investigate his cause of death. It was the coldest case Horn had ever tackled. Every modern murder investigation relies heavily on forensic science. But in Ötzi's case, the techniques have been particularly high-tech, involving exotic specialties like archaeobotany and paleometallurgy. From examining traces of pollen in his digestive tract, scientists were able to place the date of Ötzi's death at some time in late spring or early summer. In his last 2 days, they found he consumed 3 distinct meals and walked from an elevation of about 6,500 feet, down to the valley floor and then up into the mountains again, where he was found at the crime site, 10,500 feet up. 3 meals, a full day of movement, a man going about the business of his life, completely unaware that someone was tracking him, and then the final meal. After putting the stomach contents through a battery of tests, researchers determined the ice mummy's final meal: dried ibex meat and fat, red deer, einkorn wheat, and traces of toxic fern. Half of his stomach contents were fats, a deliberate, planned meal, the kind a man packs when he knows he faces a long journey through harsh mountain terrain. This was not the stomach of a man fleeing for his life in panic. This was a man who had sat down, eaten well, and then continued upward into the mountains. Because he had a full stomach, Ötzi probably was not on the run or involved in a battle. He was relaxed. He felt safe. Whoever was behind him on that mountain path was someone he had no reason to fear. But Ötzi was not entirely without wounds when he died. And here is where the forensic picture becomes darker and far more personal. Researchers found a deep wound on his right hand between the thumb and forefinger. This type of wound is called a defensive wound in forensic medicine, occurring when a victim attempts to grasp a knife blade or a sharp weapon with their hand. This means Ötzi had been involved in a hand-to-hand struggle 1 or 2 days before his death. 1 or 2 days before his death, not in the moment of the killing. Earlier, a different encounter, a fight that Ötzi apparently survived, and then continued up into the mountains as though nothing had happened, or as though the danger had passed. And then his weapons revealed something even more extraordinary. Further analysis of Ötzi and his belongings found traces of blood from at least 4 other people on the things he was carrying. One person's blood was on his knife, while 2 were on a single arrow he had with him, suggesting that he'd killed one person with a knife and shot 2 others with the same arrow that he'd managed to retrieve both times. Blood of a 4th person was found on his coat, though how it got there is anyone's guess, but experts believe it could have come from a wounded companion. 4 people. Ötzi had fought 4 different people in the days surrounding his death. He was not a passive victim stumbling through the mountains. He was a man in the middle of a violent conflict, a conflict that had already drawn blood on multiple sides. And yet, he ate his meal, he climbed his mountain, he turned his back. Their findings presented to the International Mummy Congress in Italy revealed that the Stone Age warrior was likely killed in a premeditated act of revenge. Premeditated. That word changes everything. This was not a random ambush. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Someone had decided in advance that Ötzi needed to die, had tracked him up a mountain, had waited for the right moment, and had shot him from behind while he rested or walked, unaware, at 10,500 feet above sea level. And then they did something that cracked the case wide open. Something that, 5,000 years later, told Detective Inspector Horn and his forensic team exactly what kind of killer they were looking for. Investigators concluded that Ötzi was probably killed by someone he knew because the arrow's shaft had been removed, although the arrowhead obviously remained lodged in his back. Whoever killed him also left behind a valuable copper axe, perhaps to conceal the killer's identity. The shaft was removed. The killer, after firing the fatal shot, approached the body, approached a man they had just murdered, and pulled the arrow shaft out. Not the arrowhead, which was buried too deep between the shoulder blade and the rib cage, but the shaft, the identifiable part, the part that could be traced back to the person who made it. German archaeologist Agerter Vogel said, "I believe, in fact, I am convinced that the person who shot the Iceman with the arrow is the same person who pulled it out. The positioning of the wound indicates Ötzi was shot from behind and below. The location behind the shoulder blade is the same place where prehistoric hunters aimed to bring down game in a single shot." Vogel theorized the attacker took the shaft to cover his crime and didn't take any of Ötzi's possessions because he didn't want to be linked to the murder. A killer who knew enough to remove the evidence. A killer who was careful, deliberate, and familiar with Ötzi's world. Familiar enough to know that the copper axe, one of the most valuable objects a man of that era could own, should be left behind rather than taken, because taking it would create a trail. This was not a stranger killing. Strangers take the valuable things and run. This killer left the most valuable thing behind, because the risk of being identified with it was greater than the profit of owning it. And then there is the matter of Ötzi's back. Ötzi's posture, frozen body, face down, left arm bent across the chest, could support a hypothesis that before death occurred and rigor mortis set in, the Iceman was turned onto his belly in the effort to remove the arrow shaft. The killer turned the body over, rolled a dying or recently dead man face down to dig the arrow shaft out of the wound. This required proximity. This required composure. This was not someone in a panic. This was someone who had time and used it carefully. Who does that? Who tracks a man across a mountain, shoots him precisely in the back of the shoulder, removes the evidence, leaves the copper axe, and then calmly rolls the body over to retrieve the arrow shaft? Someone with a grudge that predates the killing. Someone who knew Ötzi's possessions well enough to know what to leave. Someone who had perhaps fought with him in the days before, or who had sent others to fight with him. Someone from his own world, his own community. Now add to this the most stunning forensic revelation of all, a discovery that came not from the crime scene but from the genome. Contrary to earlier artistic depictions which portrayed Ötzi with light skin and a full head of hair, the genetic analysis indicates that he likely had dark skin, dark eyes, and male pattern baldness. The man the world had been picturing, the pale, bearded, wild-haired hunter of the Alps, was as a fiction built from assumption. The analysis of his genetic makeup has revealed the 5,300-year-old mummy had dark skin and dark eyes, and was likely bald. The genome analysis revealed phenotypic traits such as high skin pigmentation, dark eye color, and male pattern baldness that are in stark contrast to the previous reconstructions that show a light-skinned, light-eyed, and quite hairy male, said Johannes Krause from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. The man who was murdered on that mountain pass was not the man we thought we knew. He has been misrepresented even in death. His face reconstructed from our assumptions rather than from his biology. In 2023, science finally corrected the record. Ötzi looked more like his mummy than like any of the reconstructions. Dark-skinned, dark-eyed, balding, middle-aged. A real man. A specific man. Someone's neighbor, someone's rival, someone's former friend. And there is one final piece of evidence that has never been resolved, that sits at the heart of this case like an unanswered question etched in stone. The blood on the fourth person's coat. The wounded companion. Findings indicated that Ötzi may have stood his ground and fought off several foes after being shot, and was then helped by a friend. According to DNA analysis of blood found in Ötzi's arrows, knife, and coat, there was DNA from 4 separate people, including the Iceman himself. Someone was with Ötzi. Someone whose blood ended up on his coat. Perhaps a companion he carried, or who leaned against him in the aftermath of the earlier fight. Someone who knew what was happening to Ötzi in his final days. Someone who may have known, or guessed, or feared who the killer was. That person's identity has never been established. They left no mummy. They left only a few cells of blood pressed into the fabric of a dead man's coat 5,300 years ago on a mountain in the Alps. No one knows who killed Ötzi or why. The arrow attack from behind, the removal of the shaft, and the earlier hand wound paint a picture of violent conflict, but the specific circumstances remain unknown. Was this a personal dispute, a territorial conflict, a robbery gone wrong, or warfare between communities? The forensic evidence proves murder beyond doubt, but the human story died with Ötzi on that mountain pass. What we know is this. 5,300 years ago, a dark-skinned, dark-eyed, balding man of middle age climbed into the mountains of what is now the Italian-Austrian border. He carried a copper axe, 14 arrows, a knife, a fire kit, and the blood of 4 other people on his weapons and clothing. He had been in a serious fight days before his death. He sat down, somewhere above 10,000 feet, and ate a careful, well-prepared meal of dried meat and grain. And then he continued upward, calmly, unhurried, into the arms of someone who had already decided he would not come back down. The killer retrieved the arrow shaft, left the copper axe, rolled the body over, and walked away into a world that had no forensic science, no DNA laboratories, no Munich detectives, no cold case files. They could not have known that 5 millennia later, every choice they made in those final minutes would be read, analyzed, and interpreted by scientists who would look at a frozen body in a mountain gully and piece together not just the death, but the motive, the method, the relationship, and the psychology of the person who committed the world's oldest known murder. The case is still open, the killer is still unidentified, but they are no longer a mystery. They were someone Ötzi knew, someone he turned his back on, someone he trusted one final time. And that mistake cost him everything. Thanks for watching. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore more discoveries that continue to reshape our understanding of the world and our place in it. Until next time.